Good morning. My name is Jenny Tobin, and I'd like to thank you for joining our web event today on preventing employee fraud. Throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to email them to webevent@ascendsoftware.com. We certainly understand that employee fraud can be a sensitive subject for organizations, and we will preserve the privacy of your organization as we answer any questions today. This is such an important topic. We have Lee Blattner, the CEO of Ascend Software, with us today, and he's going to take us through the nuances of employee fraud and provide real-world situations for protecting your organization.
Thanks, Jenny. I have to confess, I love a good heist film. The excitement of whether they'll get caught in the ingenious ways they find to get around state-of-the-art security. There's nothing like it. But in the real world, the thieves aren't so glamorous, and the security isn't so state-of-the-art. In fact, they don't even really need to be all that clever. But what they steal from companies, hospitals, and nonprofits is nothing short of staggering. Fraud costs the average organization 5% of revenue. 5%. That's more than the profit of the average hotel or retail store. 5% is the difference between many hospitals making and losing money. The cost of employee fraud is enormous. One of my first jobs was with a large government contractor that had sophisticated security, yet we were still taken for tens of thousands of dollars. What I learned from that experience was that every organization is vulnerable. Very average people can overcome a staggering amount of security, and oftentimes getting caught is just a matter of their own greed and dumb luck. You see, the truth is, it doesn't have to be ingenious to be effective. The average loss from employee fraud is $145,000, and most of the time, the money is never recovered. You remember in the movie Jurassic Park? The caged velociraptors were constantly testing the fences and looking for weaknesses. Well, the person that commits employee fraud is dangerous because they know your systems. Sometimes through trial and error, they've tested your fences, and they know what gets flagged and what passes through. They know where your system is weak and where you're vulnerable. Today, we're talking about employee fraud and Ascend's advanced fraud prevention solution. We'll talk about where fraud happens, what it looks like, how much it's costing you, and how to protect yourself from being vulnerable. By the end, I'll show you how our advanced fraud prevention solution shines a bright light on fraudulent activity that stops it before it costs you. Employee fraud generally falls into one of three categories: financial statement fraud, corruption, and asset misappropriation. Financial statement fraud is sometimes called creative accounting, which kind of makes it sound like an artistic endeavor, but it's really just a variety of schemes to falsify assets and revenue. Think Enron and MCI WorldCom. Now, it's typically committed by the people who stand to benefit the most, the executives. Now, when this happens, it has the potential to have a devastating effect, but fortunately, this is the least common type of fraud. Corruption usually takes the form of purchasing or sales schemes that have a conflict of interest or involve invoicing kickbacks. In other words, bribery. The vast majority of corruption cases involve more than one person and involve people from either upper management or purchasing. Now, some of your big warning signs are a person that has an unusually close relationship with vendors and seems to have control issues with their work. This also includes things like bid rigging, an RFP that's specifically designed so that only one vendor can win. I read of a school district recently that published an RFP that called out the specific physical dimensions of the tablet devices they wanted to purchase. And would you believe it? Only one vendor could satisfy that. Now, that's certainly suspicious, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the people involved benefited personally. Corruption cases can be complicated, but it's important to know that the people that participate in corruption also commit other forms of fraud, most commonly billing schemes. Asset misappropriation is the third category of employee fraud, and we'll spend most of our time here. Why? Because studies show that 85% of fraud committed against organizations like yours is done through this category. Asset misappropriation is simply an employee that steals or misuses an organization's resources. Now, there are two pillars under this heading: cash theft and physical asset theft. For cash theft, think of things like a false expense report or a false invoice. For physical asset theft, it could be something as simple as stealing a pencil or a paperclip, or it could be something large like stealing a forklift. For all fraud, the key to minimizing your exposure is having controls in place. So what's the most common control that organizations take? Well, the answer is external audits. Now, here's the bad news. You're more likely to discover fraud by accident than through an external audit. Now, this will be fun. Here we have a couple of employees, Questionable Jimmy and Reliable Ron. Questionable Jimmy has a questionable work history, and he's only been working here for a few months. It seems that when he was in college, he had a run-in with the law over a stolen mascot. He shows up late every day. He's quick to leave early and always comes in on Monday with stories of his latest party exploits. Now, Reliable Ron, on the other hand, is one of those guys that you can always count on to be there and get it done. Year after year, this guy consistently delivers and is one of the hardest workers around. In fact, you can hardly force this guy to take vacation. Sure, he may grumble from time to time about being underpaid, but I've seen his car, and from what I see, he gets paid plenty. So you get the picture? Questionable Jimmy doesn't sound like a very good employee, but there's nothing in this profile that statistically points to fraud. Reliable Ron, on the other hand, is a classic example. Most fraud is committed by people who've been in the company for more than 5 years. Most of the time, it's their first offense. Oftentimes, they complain about being underpaid and show signs of living beyond their means. In this case, the most troubling sign is an unwillingness to take vacation. Now, there are plenty of other red flags: an unwillingness to share duties, financial difficulties, divorce, an unusually close relationship with vendors and customers. But in the end, there are plenty of good people that never steal who fall into all of these categories. The most important takeaway from profiling real-life fraudsters is that these are people that are trusted. Oftentimes, the very people you'd think would be the least likely to steal. How do you protect yourself against that? Fraud has a life. The longer it lives, the more it costs you. When I mentioned that the average fraud was $145,000, I'm sure there were some of you that thought there is no way $145,000 is going missing and we wouldn't catch it. Well, most detected fraud isn't a single incident. When they find that you're vulnerable, they go back and do it again. You see, the fact is, most fraud goes undetected for 18 months. That's a year and a half of them hitting that same weakness again and again. Anything that we can do to compress the detection cycle translates into money saved. But make no mistake, our real goal is to stop fraud here, before it costs you anything, before you're vulnerable. Let's talk for a moment about fraud deterrence, detection, and fraud prevention. All three should be part of your strategy to combat fraud, but I find that most organizations think in terms of detection instead of deterrence and prevention. Fraud deterrence is your first line of defense. Examples of this are job rotations, segregation of duties, as well as the safeguards controlling access to your physical assets and information. At its core, fraud deterrence is simply eliminating the opportunities that enable fraud. Now, this is important. Fraud isn't a random event. It will happen when the conditions are right for it to occur. Yet we know with all of these safeguards, enough fraud gets past this barrier to be 5% of revenue. Detection is our last line of defense. I don't know about you, but when I think about detection, I think of a room full of auditors combing through financials and looking for problems. Internal and external audits are absolutely important. But if I add up all of the fraud caught by external audits, internal audits, IT controls, account reconciliation, confessions, or just caught by the police, they don't add up to one single method of detection: an employee tip line. Prevention is our last barrier before fraud starts costing us. I believe fraud prevention is most effective when it's not defensive, but rather circumstantially predictive. Now let me say that a better way. Defensive barriers to fraud are good and necessary, but to prevent fraud, you need to take a close look at everything that makes up a financial event and use that information to predict and assess the likelihood of this being an attempt at fraud. Again, deterrence, detection, and prevention should all be part of your strategy to combat fraud. So let's take a look at a real-world case of fraud and see what deterrence and prevention actually look like. True story. This company has accounting running like a well-oiled machine. Most of the clerks have been there for years, and the ball just doesn't get dropped. Now here's where things went sideways. Invoices were coming in from a well-known and often used vendor. The problem was the invoices didn't actually come from the vendor. They came from someone inside accounting. At just the right time, they changed the vendor's remit to address to their home address in the system, and then they changed it back again after checks were processed. They opened a phony bank account using an acronym that matched the vendor, and no one was the wiser. From 10,000 feet, everything looked normal. Now, how can I deter fraud in this case? Well, the easy answer is segregation of duties. If you don't have your vendor information locked down with segregation of duties in mind, well, you're just asking for trouble. The fraud from this story is just one of many ways that access to vendor information can be misused in fraud. Now understand, fraud by manipulating vendor information is still possible even with segregation of duties. We've only reduced the likelihood of it occurring. On the other hand, fraud prevention would stop fraud before it fully developed. When it's clear what people are trying to do, but before money actually left your organization. In this story, fraud prevention would look at the vendor to see if anything changed since the last time we paid an invoice, and might even look to see what's located at that address. Now that's a good idea, but it's not practical for human beings to do this on any kind of scale needed for a large organization. Well, at least not before invoices were late. But now we're getting closer to the right idea. What we really need. We want fraud prevention, and we want it to cover the most prolific sources of fraud, namely billing schemes, overstated and falsified expense reports, and fraudulent check requests. But for this to scale, we need it to be automated and integrated into the AP process. Ascend's Advanced Fraud Prevention is a proactive control that examines these types of financial transactions before they do their damage, before they cost you money. It considers your organization's spending habits, your vendor's historical invoicing patterns, and your approver activity. It looks for anomalies and inconsistencies and flags them for closer scrutiny. Let's take a closer look at how it works. Ascend's Advanced Fraud Prevention looks at invoices, travel and expense reports, and check requests after they've been approved, but before they get entered into your financial system for payment. Every single transaction is scrutinized in less than a second using multiple algorithms that take into account the proven patterns and historical indicators of fraudulent activity. These algorithms are used to create a weighted score that indicates the likelihood of fraud. When an invoice is suspected of fraud, it shows up on a dashboard like this one. The fraud examiner can review the scores to better understand why the invoice was flagged. A timeline of the invoice showing every human interaction can be seen by clicking on the timeline. The invoice itself may be reviewed, sent for payment, or canceled. I can also look at invoices from a historical perspective and even do what-if scenarios to see how changing my threshold score affects workload. It's really just that simple. The heavy lifting is done behind the scenes. So let's compare the difference between, say, an internal audit or internal fraud detection team to that same team using Ascend's Advanced Fraud Prevention. The team alone examines 5% of transactions at random. On the other hand, Ascend's Advanced Fraud Prevention examines 100% of transactions so that the team can focus on the 5% that are most likely to be fraudulent. The team alone, fraud lives an average of 18 months prior to anyone knowing it exists. On the other hand, with AFP, fraud is stopped before it occurs. With the team alone, the average cost of fraud is $145,000. On the other hand, with AFP, the cost of detected fraud is nothing. With the team alone, the short-term odds of detection favor the thief. On the other hand, with AFP, the odds always favor your company. Now, I understand that some of you are thinking, team, I'll be lucky to have one person do this. That's okay. The software can be tuned to provide a workload that's consistent with your goals, making sure you're always working the most suspicious transactions. You know, Ascend has actually been in the fraud prevention business for quite some time. Let me share with you one last true story. An organization has many remote locations, each with their own manager. These managers are compensated based on year-over-year improvements in profitability. So this clever thief scheme was to hide invoices coming into his location so that the cost of doing business would go down, while his monthly profits would go up, resulting in a healthy bonus. Now, this fraud was detected by accident when another employee found the unpaid invoices hidden away. Preventing fraud starts with having the proper proactive controls in place. In this case, the organization prevented this type of theft moving forward by using our Smart Touch AP solution. The structured routing with integrated approval limits and escalations enforce policies and procedures in a way that's not easily susceptible to circumvention. This is an important point. If your AP invoice automation solution is currently using some type of ad hoc routing for approvals, understand that this is a potential weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited to circumvent your business processes. Smart Touch AP is an excellent proactive control for preventing this type of fraud. You may have heard of the fraud triangle theory. Fraud starts with a need, a financial pressure. That's followed by a rationalization. Well, they're crooks anyway. I deserve this. Finally, an opportunity presents itself. Well, there will always be people with a need, so that's not something we can systemically address. The rationalization is something we can affect. If the business climate coming down from the top is one of honesty and integrity, studies show that you will reduce your risk of fraud by 9%. Perceived opportunity is the side of this triangle where we want to make the biggest impact. The threat of likely detection is one of the most powerful factors in preventing fraud because it reduces the perceived opportunity. When new customers implement Ascend's advanced fraud prevention, we recommend that they make it known. Make it known that now all of your invoices, travel and expense reports, and check requests are undergoing an automated scrutiny that is always watching and always improving. Now notice I said improving. That's because as time goes on, the product better understands you and your vendors. Remember, in all likelihood, these are first-time offenders, not hardened criminals. Their fear. The fear of being caught is your most powerful weapon in influencing their behavior. John Worm from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners observed that having computer systems in place that flag unusual transactions can reduce losses by 60%. 60%. Now let's see, with fraud costing your company an average of 5% of revenue, that's a net savings equal to 3% of your company's revenue. So if you're a billion-dollar company, that's $30 million. Or if you're a $100 million company, that's $3 million. No matter what your size, a 3% savings in top-line revenue is a ton. Ascend's advanced fraud prevention is a tunable, targetable, scalable, proactive control that reveals the most common fraudulent activities before they cost you. Thank you for your time, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Okay, our first question of today is, you mentioned that if there's an unwillingness to take vacation, that's an indicator of employee fraud.
Mm-hmm.
So why is that?
I get this question a fair amount. What happens when you go on vacation? Well, someone else does your job. Well, for someone that's committing employee fraud, that means that someone might discover what they've been hiding. Oftentimes these fraud schemes have a lot of moving parts, and that makes them particularly fragile. That's why we see control issues and an unwillingness to take vacation in these situations, because they need to protect their crime from discovery.
Our next question. Are there tools available for profiling employees to identify the ones that are most likely to commit employee fraud?
I'm not aware of any, although it wouldn't be very hard to do. That being said, I would strongly advise against taking that approach. The problem is that the person that commits employee fraud, oftentimes they look like our very best employees. The people that are most committed to our success. We don't want to put them under that kind of scrutiny without clear evidence that they did something wrong. What I like about Smart Touch AFP is that it helps you gather evidence of fraud early on so that you're taking action for a real reason rather than looking through, some kind of minority report for who might commit fraud in the future.
Next question. Our security team has specific things they look for when reviewing expense reports, like if there is an expense for an airfare but not hotel. Can your product be extended to use some of our internal algorithms?
Yes, we can absolutely add your internal fraud checks into the detection engine. The team at Ascend, they designed the fraud detection engine to be an extensible thing so that as new detection algorithms are developed, we can easily plug them into the existing system.
The last question we have time for today is, there seems to be reluctance in my company to talk about employee fraud. Do you have any advice for how to build a case for an automated solution like the one you presented today?
I understand the reluctance. If you're a public company, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your stockholders to be good stewards. And oftentimes not catching fraud looks a lot like negligence. Now, I know it's a lot more complicated than that, but everyone knows that when fraud does go public, all eyes first go to the thief, and then they go to the executives and staff that allowed it to happen. So there's just a big part of people that just don't want to see it and don't want to admit that it happens. As far as advice, listen, the numbers are clear. No organization of any reasonable size is immune from employee fraud, and the impact is almost certainly more profound than people want to believe. I would point to stats from an impartial body like the ACFE that I mentioned earlier. 5% of organizations' revenue lost to fraud. 60% of that may be protected by automated fraud detection software. And then I'd put it in concrete terms. What would an additional 3% profit mean for our organization? What projects could get completed with that kind of money? I think that would be the approach I'd take.
And with that, we want to thank you for joining us here today. If we didn't get to your specific question or you think of another question later today, please just email us at webevent@ascendsoftware.com and we'll respond to each and every question shortly. So again, thank you very much for your time and have a great day.